You graduate from East Ridge, 1998. You go right to New York City to work with the homeless. 17 years old. What prompted you to do that?
So I actually started Bible college around that time and actually had to leave Bible college because I ran out of money. And so the school I was going to, actually a very kind person paid for me to move down there so that I would actually have a place to live. Because my home at the time with my mom was full of people and I really didn't have a place to stay. So they were like, remember the day that they literally like handed me money and they said, we'll get you down there. And they literally packed up my stuff and I went down to New York.
Why?
I had already been there previously for a ministry opportunity through the school. And so we worked in Queens Astoria, we worked all over the city, like people who use drugs, sex workers. We worked with those that were, like Teen Challenge was really big in those days, right? So they had these houses all around New York, like in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens. We would go in there and do stuff and just talk with them. They'd have like some of these guys had like gardens in the back of their homes and stuff, so we'd help them with that. But a lot of it was just that it was a place to go and I really enjoyed being there. So I was able to go back there because I was like, I don't have a place to live, so I gotta go somewhere. So I was glad it was New York.
What was that experience like?
It was very eye-opening for me. I was very young to be there on my own. And I remember the day my mom didn't have any money either to keep me in school, because that was the reason why I left in the first place. And she literally handed me whatever money she had and just left me there. And so that was the last time I saw her for probably about 2 years. And I really enjoyed New York. I felt like an adult, right? I was doing adult stuff, like getting up, going to Elizabeth Street, going shopping and being really cool. But ultimately, I think the most experience that I had was that I got to really experience the world that a lot of people don't see in New York City, right? The people that are homeless there, what being homeless in New York City is like, right? If you're a woman, if you are female identifying, right? Your likelihood of dying is like 4 to 5 times the average of somebody that is not female or female identifying. And that is even true up here, right? So I got to experience that, and then as a clinician, thinking about my days then, and like seeing all of the things that I saw, like working with people that were homeless, sex workers, now kind of like the disease correlation. I was like, oh, well, they had, heart failure. Oh, they had, some sort of like sexually transmitted infection that's kind of materializing on their skin. So it's really interesting to see how things, like how your life kind of weaves itself together.
What did prompt you to go and become an EMT in the actual physical care part of all this?
So actually, it was because I became very ill, and I have a condition that's incredibly painful. And just like a lot of Black and brown people all over the country, I didn't have health insurance. And I was newly married at the time, and we couldn't afford it. And so even before then, when I was coming out of New York City, I worked in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia in a while, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, doing some like homeless or youth outreach, right, for at-risk youth. Still didn't have insurance, but I was in such terrible pain, I actually had to come home to my mom's house. And I just decided, I was like, well, I'm gonna have to do something. And so finally, when I was better, I had known so much more about how to navigate the medical system, having to go through it so much. Like I was having doctor's appointments like 1 or 2 times a week. I was had by 2004, 2005, I'd already had, or 2006, I'd had 3 surgeries. So all major, and all like having to navigate the system alone, right? So as an EMT, that's how I kind of broke into the medical world. My family's background is in medicine. My grandmother was an RN in New York City, so that's how my family ended up there. But for me, as an EMT, it was really kind of I really loved emergency medicine. Really wanted to get some hands-on experience, and also my grandmother worked in Brooklyn, very, very like 1950s. She worked on the preemie ambulance back then. So she graduated from Harlem Hospital, which I actually have her plaque on my wall, her degree.
And then 15 years after graduating high school, you go and become a physician's assistant. That's a big step. I mean, you're, got to be approaching 30 years old, if not more, and you changed your career?
Yep, yeah, so I I mean, I really didn't have much of a direction, except I knew I wanted to do medicine, but really wasn't sure how that was going to happen, right? So EMS was really amazing. Like, I met some really amazing people and got to see some really amazing things. But you know, I also worked in the hospital, like as an emergency room technician. But it was really a huge step for me to apply and to be like, okay, I can do this. The reason why I actually ended up getting the application forward is because one of the PAs that worked on that I had a previous surgery with, that actually performed surgery on me, that was an emergency surgery that I needed. I was like, what's a PA? And she told me, and I was like, I don't know what that is. Tell me more about it. So she actually arranged for me to shadow her husband, now husband at the time. So he's a surgery PA here in Rochester, and that's how I decided. I was like, yeah, I think I'm going to do this.
Wow. Where does that care? I think a lot of people just care for others. There are people like you and so many others in the medical world that take that to the next level and say, I'm going to actually make that my professional job. Where does that kind of care come from for you?
Yeah, I would say, again, I think there's an urgency that really is driving me, and has driven me for many years, of just like having to, you know, navigate the medical system as a young black woman, as, you know, had to coach other black people in how to navigate the system themselves, knowing that the system is not meant to work for you. It was not built for you. And having to try to get people through that world, right? And knowing that, you know, if I had my knowledge and experience that I could bring to the table, also my medical experience and expertise, that really could change some folks, change some lives. But ultimately, you know, this is a situation where, you know, black and brown people are so disproportionately affected by chronic illnesses, disease, mental health, right? And so there really just isn't enough resources. And so that's how I became a physician assistant, how I eventually transitioned into what I do now.
But correct me if I'm wrong, that care was seen in your life before your own condition.
Yeah.
So is it built in from the parents? Where does?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just natural.
Yeah.
I mean, my grandmother was a nurse for many years. My aunt has been an HIV nurse since the 80s, like 1986, so she still practices in HIV. My mom is a mental health professional, so I would say it's instinctive. I think my grandmother, though, is the biggest influence on my family. She's passed away, but, you know, in the 1930s, Alabama, she lived there in the middle of nowhere, and she was very, very smart and graduated a valedictorian of her class. And she told her parents she was going to move away. She wanted to go to school to become a nurse, and they disowned her right then and there. And they're like, well, sorry, no. You either stay here or you don't come back. And so she chose to leave and move to New York City. And so that, I think, like, it's one thing to care about people, but to put care in action is another thing, right? To actually sacrifice for the sake of caring for yourself and caring for others is another thing. And so ultimately what ended up happening is she had to come back and care for my great-grandmother, who developed tuberculosis and actually ended up saving her life.
How did you transition from that very direct help to what could be considered more indirect help through the PAB?
I don't see it as indirect help. I see it as direct, because like all of my people that serve on the board, we all bring in knowledge and expertise and experiences to what we do now in the PAB. That's not all I do in the community, though. And so I think of it as just an extension of what I do, an extension of what I can bring. And I would say that my other board members would say the same thing, but that's what I would say.
Yeah, I don't mean to demean it.
No,
or
no,
make it
not
seem
at
less
all.
impactful. It's just,
Yeah.
you're on the ground, right,
Yep.
face to face. Here you're helping at a more broad
Yeah,
conceptual
yeah,
level.
yeah. Well, I would say a level that actually, yeah, I see what you're saying, where it's like kind of the looking down at the actual from the mountain, right?
A managerial type, programmatic level, if you will.
I think that it's amazing to have community members that are actually have that knowledge, on the ground experience, that can actually bring it to the actual governmental structure, right? And really, I mean, that's what actually government should be, right? It's a community it's actually like an experiment, right? How do we get community members to actually invest and create these structures that actually work for community members? And that's why the PAB exists. That's why it took so long to get it passed. And that's why it will continue, honestly, is because of the community, and that the community is in in a lot of different ways invested in what the actual future of Rochester is going to look like. And that future has to include police reimagining, police reform, or just making sure that people are held accountable within a Rochester Police Department.
So you take this leadership role in the PAB, it gets voted in, and then the main power gets stripped away, the power to discipline officers if some type of misconduct is found. Has it been frustrating to be part of this operation and be missing that component?
You know, I will say at first it was frustrating, right? Because I think I thought about, I didn't ever join the Alliance, right? I joined the Alliance very later on, and actually was asked by a friend to actually apply for the PAB. And I felt very sad for those that had to work so hard to get, and remember, you know how these things are passed. It takes a little bit of moving forward inch by inch, right? And a lot of people really sacrificed to make that happen. And I think at first we were disheartened, but then when I saw that there was a lot that needed to happen, still needs to happen, and a lot that we could do with what we have now, that really makes, like, the PAB was powerful to begin with. You know, it just, I don't think it doesn't make us less powerful. I think really discipline, but really discipline adds on another layer of accountability. That's what I think.
Yeah. With so many debates that I end up covering issues, people make it black and white, or in this case, us versus them. You have those who are pro-blue and those in the BLM, and I'm not saying everyone, but like those in the periphery, they try to label them. And so the label that I hear from those on the some on the law enforcement side is like, oh, the PAB and everyone with it is just anti-cop. Yeah. I'm sure you've heard that. What's your response to those folks who might be watching this that have that perception?
So I've had to address this a couple of times with folks that, you know, we have actually a really great group of board members, a lot of them that are really not so keen on police, and then there are a lot of them that are. But I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of frustration within the community at large that is kind of really, you see it in the PAB, right? That people really want police to work on their behalf. They don't want to be afraid of the police. They want to make sure that when they call the police officer that they'll respond within a certain amount of time, right? They want to make sure that they're not being threatened or harassed, or, you know, that their family's not being threatened or harassed. And those that are, you know, that are leaning more towards pro-police, they'll say, we want officers to have access to mental health training for people in the community, right? You have to know the community in which you're living in, right? You have to know, like me as a clinician, I've worked in inner city medicine for almost 9 years. I have worked in that world, so I have a pretty good sense of what working here is like, right? I think that a lot of it is built on like, it just seems adversarial to a lot of people, right? Like I really just have to police you instead of know you. And I think that that's where, like, I think pro-police really wants to see that there's like mental health treatment, mental health training. They want to see that there's an in-depth training about Rochester, and also for police themselves, making sure that they have access to mental health, access to burnout, fatigue, right, compassion fatigue, because all that's real. And that if there are, because, you know, post-traumatic stress and stress disorders, you know, they are insidious, right? One day you're, you know, sitting in a friend, you know, sitting on a job, you know, and I always talk about the red sweater. You see somebody with a red sweater on that was, you know, 2 days ago you had a domestic violence victim that had a red sweater. Then you see your daughter wearing the same red sweater, and all of a sudden you get triggered. And they don't really seem to understand why. That's common for post-traumatic or traumatic stress. That stuff has to be addressed, because that is essentially going to affect how you deal with me, how you deal with the public, especially if you are burned out, you're stressed out, and you're also traumatized.
It's interesting how it seems like your perspective on a lot of this is colored by your past experience with health. It seems like, you know, you see a health issue built into this particular part of our society.
Yeah. Well, also too, as a clinician, right? I mean, I've worked in FQHCs since I started working as a PA. I completely understand what it's like to be burned out, and also have the burden of caring for people that look like me, and also knowing that it's like they have to navigate a system that doesn't work for them, right? It is, and I didn't even add on the layer of COVID. I think that there's a real, there's there's an intersection of medicine and policing, and that there is a lot of there's articles on cops and stress, but also there's a lot of more articles. There's a lot more articles on medicine and stress, and like doctors, people killing themselves because they're stressed out. Right, that was happening before COVID. Right. So I think that there's a lot of bells to ring and be like, what does this actual structure look like? In medicine, for instance, we have a depression scale. Is there such depression scale that exists within policing, the police department here? Because insidious signs of stress, fatigue, and burnout. I'm not looking for over signs where a job goes wrong and then all of a sudden, you got to deal with it within the mental health realm. I'm talking about 3 months earlier when you actually were seeing signs in your buddy that you were in a car with, and you're like, man, I don't know what to do. We're just going to ignore that, right? I'm talking about those signs, not the stuff that's at the other end where things have just gone very wrong.
Now that you've been in the weeds, so to speak, and you've been spearheading a lot of this stuff, are you more or less optimistic now than you were when you began this?
For PAB?
Yeah,
or for everything?
Why don't we just say police community relations?
I would say, I think police community relations has a long way to go. I think so. I think that it seems to be multi-layered, right? If you have influence or if you're a stakeholder in this town, you get a certain amount of engagement. And that's not just with policing. If you are not of influence and that you're just somebody just in the streets or on North Street, for instance, or in somewhere like near the bus station, I don't think you'll get that same interaction. And so I would even say just a consistent interaction, right? So I think that all of that has to be consistent all the way down. For people that don't have any influence, like somebody near my apartment overdosed the other day, and I actually had a great experience with the officer that was on scene with me. And I was just walking. I was actually on a walk, and I usually have Narcan on me at all times, but I was just going for a walk and took my other bag with me. But a passerby was like, do you need some Narcan? I was like, yeah. And I mean, that lady ended up living, but still it was like the interaction with the officer was actually really great. So I just,
for consistency.
yes,
Yeah.
I think that's what the city is asking for. And actually, the thing is too, is that there has to be a discussion about how, like, officers and the community, if you're gonna talk about community relations, it's like, you're traumatizing the public by how you're interacting with them. Youth are telling me that there are certain officers that are patrolling their neighborhoods that they have nicknames because they are afraid of them, right? And that's not new stories. And the thing is too, is like, officers that know certain streets know that these kids are seeing their friends, their family, people being killed. They're seeing so many traumatic events day after day after day. How is it going to affect your interaction with them when they see you?
I guess my last question, the other aspect of this, because you live in that community, your thoughts on gun violence. I've been here for 10 years. We've both been in the community for a long time, and we constantly hear stop the violence, end the violence. It's every week, and so there's that other aspect of that. Your general thoughts, I know that's not necessarily your focus, but just because of your experience, I'd love to get your general thoughts on it.
So interestingly enough, because of the neighborhood I live in, I had somebody get shot right outside my door. So I think that I take an approach of, I think people wouldn't feel like they needed guns if they felt safe, right? And yep, there are people that are, they call it beefing out there, like that are, having rivalries with each other, but the majority of the people that I experience in my clinic are people that carry knives and guns because they're afraid that somebody will hurt them. And there's also the, so a lot of times, remember, after, the fentanyl crisis here, what happened? A lot of people ended up either in jail, a lot of people ended up on the streets that were homeless, or a lot of people ended up becoming heavily involved in drugs, more than usual. And a lot of that now has, I think, and plus COVID, right? Now you have an economy that's really suffering, that was already suffering here. Now you have people that have lost their jobs, people that are homeless, and now you also have violence. So it's not surprising what we're seeing, but I think it's got to come from a psychosocial perspective of being like, okay, nobody ever has enough of anything, ever. It's always, there's never enough. And until we actually say in Rochester, there's never enough of anything, and come from that perspective instead of let's stop the violence, I wonder if that would change some things.
Yeah. What else would you like to add? I know I have a feeling like you and I could talk all day, but, well, I could ask you questions all day, but anything else you'd like to add?
No, oh, yes, I will add something.
Yeah.
I wanted to say something about young leadership in Rochester, because I think it's really important for the city to know that there are young leaders that are working out here without any recognition, day in and day out, getting the work done, right? One of the things we have here is we are very committee heavy here, board heavy. We have a lot of people that are doing a lot of things in Rochester in a lot of corporations, organizations. Sometimes that gets down to the people that actually need it, and sometimes it doesn't. But for all those times, there are young people that are actually working to make sure that people get fed, people get Narcan, people get out of situations that are domestic violence driven, especially if you're queer and black or brown, right? Especially if you're not. So I think that what I would like to see, especially from the next administration and from Rochester, is to recognize that, you know, the stakeholders that are currently in really need to make room for these young folks coming up, and that the old playbook on how things used to work is not going to work anymore. So I'm excited for these young leaders. I'm excited for young leaders like me. And I think that I think that that's what makes Rochester, that's what's going to change Rochester, are these new young faces, new young ideas, and people that are really excited about making change happen. And they're going to make it happen.